we're getting a panel together, have a chat now, which I'm very excited about. Anna, if you can join us back on the stage, please, a round of applause once again for the inimitable Anna Scarbeck. We are also welcoming to the stage someone that has carriage of some, but not all of the policies that Tennant just raced through. Head of the Energy Division within the DQ in the Australian Government, Claire McLaughlin. Round of applause for Claire. And what I'm going to describe as a bit of a soft launch for our international keynote, because I'm not getting him up here to provide his keynote, but to have a chat. I think that we should give a very warm welcome to our international speaker, Professor Amory. Round of applause. Thank you, Amory. I was very conscious that Anna and Tennant's presentation hopefully doubled as something of a briefing for you about the current state of Australian energy policy. So I hope that was helpful on top of the chats that John and I have had with you over the last few days.
There's an odd echo here, and it's almost impossible for me to hear you. I'm
I
sorry.
will say that there is an echo on the stage, which is not as noticeable on the floor. So that's a bit of a note for our friends up in the AV booth. If there's anything we can do about the echo, that would be great, because it's quite noticeable here on stage. Claire, maybe I'll start with you. What are your, Tennant's just done a demolition derby of policies, large and small, that have interacted with this industrial space over the last 15 years or so. But we're in this moment of policy innovation. There's an awful lot going on. You've got carriage of some of it through the National Energy Performance Strategy. What are your reflections on everything that Anna and Tennant have just shared, and what some of those emerging opportunities might be?
That's a lot.
Pick whichever clause you feel like you would like to address, which is your prerogative.
Yeah, thanks very much, Luke, and great to be here. And essentially what Anna and Tennant and earlier John said is more or less what I'd been going to cover in a slightly different version. I guess of Tennant's sort of quick whip through all the things, I'm sort of relieved at some level that I don't have responsibility for all of them. Yep. But together with colleagues in DQ, but also really importantly, a bunch of other portfolios across the Commonwealth, it is a lot that we're trying to do all at once. And I guess I wanted to talk really about two things fairly quickly. One of them is about the NEP, so National Energy Performance Strategy, that was released a little while ago, that I know a number of people were disappointed about because it didn't include lots of new money for lots of big things. But it does set us up with a really useful framework and a really strong opportunity to get the demand side conversation in the middle of important policy making in Canberra, including, I think, critically, the energy and electricity sector plan, which is being led by our minister. We're kicking off next week our new Energy Performance Advisory Group, which I can't say who's on it yet because it's not all completely resolved, but a lot of the people in this room are on it, and will be giving us direct and ongoing advice without having to write submissions to government inquiries, which I hope they will be pleased about, on a whole range of questions, including the ones that are the subject of this symposium today. We're very conscious that there is a really significant gap below safeguard, and that industrial decarbonisation, and particularly industrial energy efficiency, are underdone, and we need to do more. We need to find ways to do a lot more. The other thing I just wanted to spend a second on is the sector plans. Conscious that my colleagues from the Department of Industry, Science and Resources are here, which is fantastic to see. We're working really hard from my division with colleagues in DISA on particularly the industrial net zero plan, but also built environment and resources, and collaborating with colleagues in other departments on the agriculture and land plan and the transport plan. When they were all set out as a way to cover the whole economy, it was made clear that energy efficiency was a cross-cutting enabler that needed to be a feature of all of those plans. And so I guess that from my point of view, from the energy performance perspective, that's what we're trying to drive, and they're the conversations that we're currently trying to have across the Commonwealth and with state and territory colleagues. So they're our main points of focus right now.
I think one of the really strong points about the NEPs, which has been there from the very start in that first consultation paper, is bringing together the conversation around fuel switching and energy performance, energy efficiency, energy productivity. And for industrial businesses that have traditionally relied on gas for a lot of those industrial processes, like, yes, there's technology available for low temperature process heat, but kind of like how one pairs like a significant uplift in energy performance to make that technology feasible, you know, that's a big question. Then going to the kind of the precinct level, also kind of the interactions with the energy system. Actually, you know, can you access the electricity you need if you do electrify all that load? I guess there's some of the things you're trying to tease apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the electrify everything, as Anna and others have already said, you know, we need to do it, but then when we do that, what does that do to load? And then when the Treasurer stands up and says some more things about the future made in Australia tonight, what does that do to the electricity system and what we need to do there? So we've been doing a bit of work around not only load shifting and demand shifting over the course of a day, which, you know, people who've got solar panels are very familiar with duck curve problems and the need for batteries and so on, but also modelling demand over the course of a year and what is going to happen to industrial requirements for energy during winter and what that might mean. There are examples from New Zealand and other parts of the world where industries have chosen, essentially, to reduce their industrial load and their demand and do things like scheduled maintenance and other things in the middle of winter when the sun doesn't shine as much as we might want it to and the wind doesn't necessarily blow. So there's a whole lot of things that are sort of coming together to try and inform the kinds of measures and programs that might roll out once the sector plans are done. And they're very much all in the sort of storming ideas phase at the moment. People have seen the discussion paper on the energy one and provided really fantastic comments and input and ideas on that. But they're not at all settled. And there's plenty of opportunity, including from you today, to put forward ideas and talk to us about really where we should be focusing, and quite a lot of that has already been said.
And I know we're excited to have our friends from the Department of Industry with us here today, and we'll be joined by Helen Wilson at the end of the day. Amory, how are you going with the echo? Are you hearing okay?
It's a little better. I can hear
about
half of what you're saying.
They've been working on it, so we'll continue to tweak the knobs upstairs. We were talking last night about barriers that businesses have to decarbonise. And for policymakers, you were saying it can be a trap to focus too much on price when you're not removing those barriers that face businesses. Could you just unpack that idea for us a little bit in terms of your observations around the world?
Oh, I was actually struck in Tennant's excellent digest that there's a missing column of activities which might be called barrier busting. There's actually another one called design, which I'll talk about later. But there are 60 or 80 well-known market failures that practitioners in this room butt up against every day in trying to use energy in a way that saves money. And policymakers around the world tend to focus on getting the price right rather than enabling people to respond to price, which is even more important. And there are some rather obvious examples. Why, for example, do we pay our architects and engineers for what they spend, not what they save? And the public sector or the private sector could perfectly well lead in performance-based design fees, which we've tried, and they have a very salutary effect on design. There are rather simple things that, for example, a local authority could do, like if someone comes for approvals to build something, put them to the head of the queue if it's, say, a net zero or net positive building. That costs government nothing but time is money to a developer. There are each of the 60 or 80 market failures or obstacles can be turned into a business opportunity, but this takes a particular kind of policy focus that's rather rare. And I'm sure you've got the talent to do it, but it might not have occurred to people that barrier busting is so important. And I think at all levels of government, this would be a very good thing to focus on. And perhaps it's already going on, and I'll learn more in Canberra on Monday about that. We'll see.
Can I just call out what I assume is a career highlight by giving notes on one of your charts from Amory Lovin's tenant?
I'll never wash that chart again.
Amory, the other thing that came up in our conversation last night was the danger of focusing on incremental gains versus transformative change, and that by focusing on the little things that we can do to pick up small savings, sometimes that can distract us from really big change that can be made if we think at that systems level. Do you want to just speak to that?
Yeah, well, incremental change is important, but often subject to diminishing returns. The more you save, the dearer it gets. However, if you have a much higher ambition, you often find that the cost curve comes down again to less even than you started with. And I'll give some examples of this in my remarks later. But why get there the long way around when you can tunnel through the cost barrier? So in buildings, for example, you could ask, is there a reasonable way to design this building so it doesn't need mechanical equipment? And often there is, in fact, practically always there is. And then it's cheaper because you save more money getting rid of the HVAC than you pay extra for the efficiency that gets rid of it. And it's analogous in transport and in industry very often. A lot of people don't realize that the same sort of no extra cost net zero buildings approach applies perfectly well in the other sectors. And that's the big frontier. I think that Anna correctly pointed us towards, and it comes from design, not so much from technology. We've got the technology already, although it'll keep getting better.
Yep. Anna, having sort of heard tenants run through and Claire's and Amory's reflections, and we think about the policies that we've got available to us, like what are some of the areas that you think, we have policies in place and we need to evolve them to kind of meet this moment, and where do you think some of the critical gaps are?
Thanks. Very happy to pick up on this dialogue, and you're absolutely right. What Amory is describing that can be achieved by design is empowered when we embed our desired net zero goal at the heart of whichever of the policies on the list, in tenants' list and in the list that we'll discuss now. And the precinct approach that I described is a way to align multiple layers of government and multiple sectors around a common goal. And the companies themselves said, impose the goal on the place, please. And the power of that is so that it drives the demand, the design of everything, the design of the infrastructure, the design of the economic incentives, including, for example, the length of offtake contracts, because you're solving for a 30-year economic revitalisation in many of these industrial regions, not a 5-year period, which is often a government policy timeframe, understandably. We do have some significant policy tools that now enable this or almost do. And so 3 that aren't on your list, but I mentioned one of them, AEMO, our Australian Energy Market Operator, produces the ISP, the Integrated System Plan. It is currently operating on what's called the step change scenario, selected largely by a process of replicating what the market determines is most likely. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a likelihood assessment. But the green exports scenario, which AEMO has also mapped, is in fact the one that matches the Paris Agreement and the renewable energy superpower, which will be the theme of the Treasurer's speech tonight and has been accepted as a core goal of not just the federal government but all the state governments. So we can flick the switch in AEMO's planning. There is a detailed infrastructure plan already written for the energy system to be of the scale that's needed to manage all the demand that you were referring to. And I absolutely agree that that's demand minus the efficiency dividend, which is design plus improvements. So we've suggested that if it's too big a leap to do that for the whole economy, because there are still some commitments in place for the next 5 years, flick it in the industrial zones where there are multi-decade infrastructure decisions that need to be made. And those plans have been written broadly, and you would want to downscale it at the precinct scale and do a regional ISP on the green export scenario for all of our heavy industrial zones. We could do that. We can commence that immediately. I mentioned, I can't say enough how important the sector plans are, so I won't repeat what I said earlier, but just such a big moment and really fantastic that this year we have this opportunity. Government's using the word sector plan. Companies use the word transition plan. And Luke, as you will know, your colleagues and mine are working together with another program which comes from the Treasury portfolio, and this is the Credible Transition Plans program. That language is basically a sector plan for a company, but a company touches many sectors. At the heart of it all, it's a long-term net zero plan. Whatever language you use, that's what's needed. That's how we get the design thinking into it. That's what we're here to solve for. And it's how you bust through the barriers of 3-year corporate plans or 5-year policy periods, etc. Or in our natural monopoly infrastructure, regulatory reset periods, regulators are often constrained by the window that they're given. The sector plan and the transition plan can sit over that and provide the guidance that allows you to bust through those barriers. And fortunately, Treasury is about to mandate disclosure at the company level of forward emissions targets, not just what's old language, scope 1 and 2, but scope 3, which is the emissions of your suppliers and your customers. Once you do that, you need a full sector plan if you're a company. You need to know how your customers and your suppliers will change their emissions because you will be disclosing your estimates of theirs and your future targets to achieve net zero. That's coming in Treasury legislation. So the companies are saying, we want to know what the sector plan is because we want to know how our customers and suppliers are going to change. So we've got this moment now where we can say, actually, we have mapped what should guide the design. Then we're just in the game, as you've highlighted, how does policy move from low ambition to high ambition? It'll be a few steps forward and a few steps back. And these opportunities, for example, to do front of the queue type incentives before you end up doing everyone in the queue mandatory approaches. But soon we will have this ability to show what ought to be guiding. For example, all the investment that's coming from federal or state budgets should follow the sector transition plans, the AEMO green export scenario, and corporate transition plans should be first in the queue if they follow the net zero pathway. So we can actually start to knit this together with what's coming this year.
Amory?
Well, I would just add a word of caution. I'm delighted to hear of all these plans, and they're probably all obsolete before the ink is dry because everything is changing so fast. Last year alone, the world benchmark price for photovoltaic modules fell by half. That's on top of the factor 4 in a few years previously. And the drop is continuing. So in a period bracketing last year, the most market-aligned forecasters who follow tens of thousands of projects worldwide had to raise by 64% their forecast of world solar power additions in last year whilst it was going on. In other words, it was whizzing by in such a blur they couldn't see it even though they had the keenest insight. So what does that tell us about the risks to traditional industries that are using old data, old mindsets, old models? I think it means that we're all being outrun by events, and I guess part of my message later will be that there could be equally rapid surprises on the demand side.
And that means there's a very important feature in the way these new plan requirements are being established, and that is that they are baking in an outcomes metric rather than an activity one. So, for example, another Treasury policy at the moment is the Sustainable Finance Strategy, which includes a taxonomy. And a taxonomy is a bit like a labelling system for how would you achieve the plan in your sector. And the metric will be an emissions intensity metric driven by the carbon budget associated with the Paris Agreement. So it isn't saying this technology is the one you should pick forevermore, but it's saying your emissions from whatever sum of technologies you're using should decline at the rate of the carbon budget. So that's a finance sector way of saying we want to look through the noise of what technologies will change and use that to guide what success looks like. And hopefully that would drive some of that design innovation.
The only uncertainty now is between fast and faster. and it's going to be terribly hard to catch exponentials from behind. So I would urge us all to rethink how we're thinking about the future to get a great deal more agility than we've had.
Tennant?
So, there is a gargantuan gap between the domestically oriented energy transition that the central scenario of the integrated system plan represents and various flavours of energy superpower. There's a real challenge, or several of them though, in bridging the gap between those things because which exports? I mean, some of the highly energy intensive activities, industrial activities that transition largely meet domestic demand, and Australian policy has an influence on that, maybe a big influence with very ambitious policy. But a lot of it is export oriented. And AEMO, bless their cotton socks, don't know much about those markets. And Australia has very little influence on those markets. So the demand for specifically clean products is an incredibly important thing to grow. Anybody who knows me knows I have an answer to how you grow that demand, which is carbon border adjustment mechanisms in major markets. We are seeing some of that, and ideas for comparable mechanisms take shape. But if you don't know, how fast is there going to be demand for green steel in like really large quantities, you're really taking a flyer if you invest in the infrastructure and in the production capacity to meet that. And so I think we are going to have to take some flyers, but it's a very tricky process.
Is there an opportunity in the same way that we need to change our thinking around that creation of those industrial precincts, but also those bilateral relationships with trading partners to actually, say, we can work with you, we can create these supply chains, but we need to have some confidence that the demand's going to be there.
Yep.
Is that a pathway forward?
I think it is. I think that is though yet another piece of evidence in the pile of the China relationship is like, should be the most obvious observation ever, is going to remain extremely important. China takes all but a tiny fraction of our iron ore exports. If we do have ambitions in the green iron space, green steel space, I mean, yes, Japan is important, Korea is important, but a deeper economic partnership with China seems like something that's inescapable. Some people will feel very happy with that. Some people will feel nervous. I think both sides are right.
Everybody's right. I'm going to throw to the floor for a couple of questions in a moment, so get those ready. But Claire, I think you deserve a right to response. Your policy sort of agenda has grown exponentially in the last 20 minutes.
Oh, thanks, Luke. It's a fascinating conversation and it's really important. And I think that the point about where we pitch our ambition is absolutely critical. Before I came into this job, not 15 years ago, 15 months maybe.
Feels like 15 years.
Maybe it does. I used to listen to the radio most mornings, and our Minister, Chris Bowen, would be counting down how many months it was to 2030. Yesterday he said it's 67. That's not very many, and so we should all be alert and alarmed and very pleased that our colleagues in Treasury are pushing as hard as they are on all of their plans and processes. But yeah, I just wanted to echo the point really that Anna's made a couple of times that whether the sector plans last for longer than the ink is dry or not, the fact of doing them, the fact of looking really carefully at each of these critical sectors across the economy and working out where the opportunities are to decarbonise, getting advice from the Climate Change Authority, thinking about what is going on in other countries and where those opportunities are is exactly the thing that we all need to be doing right now. So yes, lots of possible pathways, fast and faster, but we're doing it, and that's absolutely critical.
So to the floor, if anyone's got a question, just pop your hand up.
I'll just add, Claire's, you're effectively referencing Eisenhower. The plan is nothing. Planning is everything.
I didn't mean to.
And what's hidden under the concept of plan that we're all talking about is goal. The reason we're planning is we've committed to the net zero goal.
Yep.
And the challenge prior was that the net zero concept is a multi-decade goal, and there's always a date put in place for a finite policy period. So by definition, it didn't finish the job of planning for net zero. And so I think it's key that if we can unleash the design innovation that Amory's talking about, we can do that by baking the goal more than the time frame into the plan.
Yeah.
And actually say the most successful plan is the one that achieved net zero the quickest and in a smooth and orderly way, with other goals, inclusive and in engaging economic participation with First Nations. There's a fairly good agreement on what good looks like for the other goals that you'd want to solve for in this transition, and it's possible to solve for them all. I think the key is that the goals are what drives it.
And I suppose in terms of that net zero goal, the other thing that we haven't perhaps spoken about as much that we should is, of course, the 2035 target, which is due to be set by early 2025. So, we can think about where we want to land in 2050, but that landing point in 2035 will be absolutely critical. We've had the Climate Change Authority come out with a consultation paper, musing various thoughts. Hello.
Sub's due today. If
There you
anybody
go.
has forgotten.
I think we might have a couple of CCA folk with us in the audience today. There you are. So if you haven't got your submissions in, you can go and chat to them and bail them up.
Ask them for an extension.
Verbal submission. Sorry. But the point is that the musing is 65 to 75% emissions reduction by 2035-ish, right? That's a lot. Particularly off 42% by 2030, that implies it's going like this. So that defines the task for the whole economy, but then the sectoral decarbonisation plans presumably defining the glide path for different sectors.
And to Amory's point that before the ink is dry, just remember that every time the climate science is updated, dates come forward. So when the Paris Agreement was first signed, the 2-degree goal was at the heart of it because the scientists had learned that that's when some of those environmental harms really entered ecosystem tipping points. But 7 years later, when the science was updated, that came forward to a 1.5-degree limit, not a 2-degree, and that chops a decade off Australia's net zero path. It means you must eliminate emissions sooner because the harms are already known to be happening sooner in terms of that volume. So again, bearing in mind that whatever the range is, if it's less than 80% by 2035, the science is already saying it needs to be over 80%, so that we're channeling to net zero far sooner as a total economy. Certainly that's what the science says. It's a game of maths. That doesn't make the politics easier, but the science and the carbon budget is mathematically knowable, and so we've been measuring that for years, and it's in the 80s for Australia, and that can change with different concepts of fair share. But just to be aware that it will always move, the more we know, the quicker we know we need to act. So bearing that in mind as well, to the same point about technology, is climate.
And we're not the only ones doing this. China is meeting its 2030 solar and wind goals this year, and there's quite a good chance that their peak carbon was last year. And a couple of years ago, a giant chemical company CEO showed us by waving his cell phone around a gigawatt of solar capacity that his company had just built that's producing hydrogen for $2.7 a kilogram. And he switched over his plant from coal to hydrogen because it was cheaper. That's about a decade earlier than most people thought. So to your point, Tennant, we're not the only ones in Australia who can make cheap green stuff.
We've got to be good.
Yeah.
So you all seem very happy just to let this all wash over you. Oh, we've got a
There's
question. We've got a question here and then a question here. And we've got one over here. All right, so questions have arisen. So we'll just... thank you, Jade. And if you can introduce yourself and your organisation.
Thank you, and my name is Margie Thompson, and I'm the CEO of the Cement Industry Federation, representing Australia's cement manufacturers. Thank you very much to all the speakers in the panel today. Really interesting discussion and really useful, particularly to our sector. My question goes to Amory. I'd really love the word barrier busting. I think it's absolutely critical if we're going to be able to have the opportunity to be able to beat the cost curve in implementing many of these new technologies. But having that social licence to operate, particularly in terms of these new technologies and the regulatory barriers that are in place, are probably just as challenging as being able to implement these new technologies and finding the finance. I'd really like to hear your comments on that, on what other countries might be doing.
Could you give an example of the sorts of regulatory barriers you're talking about?
Say, for example, you just want to implement a new type of alternative fuel to replace fossil fuels in our sector. The regulatory hoops that we need to go through for one of our, just for an example, of one of our manufacturing companies has taken 3 to 4 years.
Right. So I think the question is around, well, one of the barriers is actually, you know, the planning and the processes, the regulatory approvals one needs to step through to even try and implementing the new technology, the emerging technology. And I guess our question is asking, well, how does one, you know, work one's way through that? Are there good examples around the world of streamlining that process?
A lot of places are trying it, but your concern is correct. And a major task for government, I think, is to try to clear away some cobwebs and encourage innovation so that we learn a lot faster. And you're also completely right about license to operate. I've had heads of some of the world's largest companies tell me, you know, we're not terribly worried about regulation. We have enough influence over that process. We can generally make it come right, but we're absolutely terrified by those armies of activists with their emails, because if they decide that we're not a good company, we're gone. We lose our franchise, our license to operate. And I can't tell you how hard it is, the executives tell me, to impress on our hundreds of thousands of people around the world that every day they have to make sure we're the sort of company you want to do business with. So that is a big management challenge, particularly for the largest companies.
We have a question just up the front here. Yeah, thank you, Jade.
Hello, it's Christina Tonkin. I'm the Managing Director of Corporate Finance at ANZ. It's excellent to be here. It's a question for Anna, but maybe more broadly for the panel. You did touch a little bit on taxonomy and the kind of work that the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute is doing. Just wondering, you know, given that you talk to lots of investors and lots of financiers and insurance companies, you know, how do you think that is going in terms of a total ecosystem in the finance sector for funding companies on their transition journey? You know, where would you kind of rate it? And also probably how critical do you see it over, you know, the forthcoming period in being able to assist, motivate, fund, you know, greater, more ambitious targets on industry decarbonisation?
Thank you. Great question for one called Toolkit, because I think really the question goes to, does the finance sector see that it has a sufficient toolkit, and what role for the taxonomy in that? The taxonomy is excellent at defining ambition. It isn't enough to achieve it. If you're a finance institution that suffers barriers around economic market constraints and supply chain availability and all the other barriers that we've been discussing. So my sense from the finance sector is both really welcoming all that's coming. The definition of what good looks like helps mitigate that challenge of how can I show I'm doing the right thing if we desire to do the right thing. But also I sense that the finance sector is realising, having gotten the house in order and saying, I know I've committed to net zero, I'm now committed to disclosing and receiving disclosures from all the companies that I lend to or invest in, and within one financial year, all of those companies now will have a standardised way to tell their lender and their investor what their emissions are and what their future emissions targets are. That's fantastic progress for moving money, for moving decisions more quickly. What we haven't yet had is the realisation that when those targets aren't met or aren't high enough because they're not sure how to be met at the definition of good, how do we close the ambition gap? So that's where the sector plans come in, and we will need a lot more than just a set of sector plans with the right goals. The economic settings will have to be gotten right, and that's where CBAM and a lot more comes in. And in particular, you mentioned bilaterals and arrangements with partners. It's important that it's bilateral arrangements with nations, but it's not just governments. Supply chains themselves can start these bilaterals, and I'm hopeful that what this new corporate reporting will create is the Scope 3 supply chain conversation with far more visibility. So the finance sector attention then moves to the real economy, and how do we then help supply chains work together to do their own sector plans, guided by what government says, hopefully asking government for more. If the detail isn't in there, go back to government and say, we need more, but also make the arrangements for the green demand, the buyers and the sellers coming together. There will be time, I think, to get out of the blocks before the minimum mandatory requirements and say, we're actually just going to make a club. We now know what good looks like. None of us can yet mandate that across our 100% procurement everywhere, but we need the solution. We've got to call it forward. So I would hope that investors start saying to their companies, okay, I see your forward plan and I see you don't exactly know how to get it. Start disclosing to me how much of your supply chain have you asked, have you given them an allowance to aim for the highest bar, whether it's a green door first right of approval or whether it's we'll waive our ordinary minimum cost pressure for this first round, and make the race to be, if not, why not? Don't tell us why you couldn't get there, tell us what it would take to get there, and then show us that you've actually allocated some of your CapEx and OpEx to be the green buyer, so that you're creating the market for the green suppliers. And I think we'll see the overachievement if we can do that.
I think the taxonomy is a really important initiative, and I have some involvement in it. I think it's positive, but it is challenging to solve systemic issues asset by asset. And so I think the role of more clearly making it easier to get investment that specifically wants to be green to clearly positive things, that's very achievable. But policy that addresses systemic challenges and where there's real arguments back and forth about whether particular assets are good for the climate or bad for the climate, and that goes to systemic issues, the taxonomy is going to struggle with that. I think it's inspired some degree of nostalgia for economy-wide carbon pricing.
Wash your mouth out, Tenant. So we've got one last question here, at the back of the room. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Murray Hogarth. Thanks to a recent and still evolving reinvention of myself, I'm here as media from the Fifth Estate. And for my sins, I was at an event yesterday at UNSW also the nuclear lobby were running. And riffing off Amory's point about maybe some surprises coming on the demand side, one of the American speakers there talked about the tech bros going around buying up nuclear capacity in the US at the moment to feed their AI and data centres, and paying way above the odds. So $30 a megawatt hour to produce, 45 for the market price, and offering 95 to lock in long-term contracts. So just wondering, do you rate that sort of dramatic change on the demand side as something we really need to start to think about?
I think that's for you, Amory.
Well, not an issue here since you haven't the old nuclear plants, and if you do sums, you won't build any, since they have no business case and no operational need. They actually make climate change worse because they're so dear and so slow, regardless of the technology and fuel cycle, that they displace a lot less fossil fuel per dollar or per year than if you bought efficiency and renewables instead. It's called opportunity cost. But I should say a bit about AI, because this is now the fourth time in my memory that we've had, at least in the US, a rather coordinated campaign of hysteria created about how some sort of IT is about to eat the grid, and renewables can't possibly cope, so we need to build nuclear or gas or whatever that's not doing well in the market on its own. Well, just to remind you, 2010 to 2018, the amount of computing done in data centers rose by 550%, and the amount of electricity they used rose by 6.5%. In other words, efficiency almost completely offset the growth in service demand. And the same will happen more or less with AI, not just because it's subject to a lot of saturations. Once you've done the learning, the inference doesn't take much energy by comparison. Not just because many of the proposed data centers are being multiply counted in different utility territories where they're trying to get a deal, but also because the technology and the software are improving just as rapidly as they have historically. NVIDIA just put out a chip 3 times more efficient, a CPU 3 times more efficient than the one they have been selling. Tesla's done one 4x, and you can go a lot further than that. So the same, I'll actually illustrate it later, the same thinking that can get you 2 orders of magnitude, possibly 3, improvement in data center efficiency will apply to AI. So what in the US we have this extrapolation from a handful of utilities that get paid for selling more electricity, so they're heavily subsidizing and recruiting AI data centers to come into their territory. That's being extrapolated to the whole country and to the world. A wild extrapolation, show me the evidence. I'm very skeptical that we will see a very substantial and sustained rise in electricity demand for this purpose. Finally, remember that those US nuclear plants that are trying to do deals with data centers will find it's not a terribly good match, partly because the nuclear plant needs to shut down from time to time to refuel. Sometimes it shuts down on its own, often for weeks, months, or years, without warning. Not exactly what you want for a data center. Also, those nuclear plants were very heavily subsidized on the grounds that they would be providing their output to the grid on the theory that we needed baseload, a term with 5 different meanings, none of them useful anymore. It's a kind of antique honorific that doesn't apply to the grid we're evolving into. Now, if they get off the grid in order to run a data center on a private bilateral basis, what were we subsidizing them for? So there are a lot of very awkward economic, technical, and political questions that those deals raise. And I'm delighted that you've not made the same mistakes we made. That's good. You should only make interesting new mistakes.
We are doing our best, Amory. Are there any final thoughts from the panel before I wrap this one up? Is everyone happy?
Very happy not to talk about nuclear.
I wasn't going to do that to you, Claire. Tennant.
So I think Amory's completely right about the likelihood that AI-related demand surges will be a fizzle. As useful or not as various AI applications turn out to be. I do think it is plausible, though, because of the very trends in the decline in solar costs and other key technology costs, that like energy is, if you are sufficiently flexible in your use of it, going to be very, very, very cheap in the future, and it is plausible that a bunch of demand will appear because there will be ways to substitute energy for capital, substitute energy for labour. I think that can be a very positive thing as long as the energy is clean. So we should be ready for surprises on the demand side, but yes, some of them are not surprises. They are reheated scares of old.
And meanwhile, the search for intelligent life on Earth continues.
On that note, I think we might wrap up this panel. There's been a lot of intelligence up on stage with me. Please put your hands together for our wonderful panel.